Thank you, Territorial Representative. The floor is open. Any other member would like to debate? I recognize Honourable Penn.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for the opportunity to make my contribution to the Police Amendment Bill 2024, which will subsequently be changed, I'm sure, to 2025, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, some of the sentiments that were raised earlier by other members are sentiments that I share, and I think it's important for us to reinforce some of those areas, Mr. Speaker. So I wouldn't go into all those areas, but some of those areas in particular, Mr. Speaker, will be raised because I believe it's important for us to reemphasize and reinforce some of the very specific concerns that we see in this bill that we've expressed to the Premier when it was first brought to the House in December. And some of those same concerns still exist. Yes, we will sit here, Mr. Speaker. We will do the work to fix this bill, as we've done in the previous session of the House Assembly, where we had a series of bills for the Commission Inquiry implementation and the mutual evaluation work that we did. And we were very diligent to do that work, Mr. Speaker. But at the end of the day, Mr. Speaker, the debate is important. The bill before us does not represent a bill, as was mentioned by members and other members, and I share that sentiment, that I could support in its current form. We need to ensure, well, I want to say this, Mr. Speaker. I want to make sure I call you Mr. Speaker, not say Madam Speaker. I have to say this, Mr. Speaker, in terms of the support for the police force and law enforcement in this country. And the suggestion and the assertion made earlier is very unfortunate, and it created an emotional sense of the fact that somehow the members on this side, because of the fact that we wanted to ensure that the public had more time to understand and read and understand the implications of this bill on them personally, to ensure that I myself, Mr. Speaker, asked for more in-depth conversation before we actually got into the debate, to really understand for ourselves some of these implications and what it would mean for our people so that we could properly and adequately communicate these implications on our people. And that was the reason why I supported us to wait on the second and third reading to ensure that the people had that opportunity to understand those concerns before we go into the committee stage. Mr. Speaker, committee stages are private, so the conversation, discussion that happened in the committee stage will not be aired publicly, and the public won't have the benefit of those conversations, those changes, until the bill is assented to and gazetted, which sometimes could be months afterwards, Mr. Speaker. So I want to put on the record my position, why I felt it was important for us to have some time and give the people some time to understand the implications of this particular bill. Mr. Speaker, Premier talked about, and he sort of tugged the emotional heartstrings, specifically to the crimes that have been committed in this territory over the years. None of us, not to a man, none of us in this Honourable House supports criminality. None of us are happy with the level of criminality that we're seeing in the territory. We would all seek to ensure that the police force has the necessary tools to do their job. But as was said by other members in this House, there needs to be the necessary checks and balances to ensure there's not abuse of that authority, and ensure that the public and the citizenry is able to have the level of comfort knowing that the tools are there to keep them safe, but they also have the necessary checks and balance to ensure that they themselves are not victim of undue surveillance and other elements that's listed within this particular legislation that is before us. She could have issued the emotional aspect of it. And I recall when I was in University, and we had 9/11. It happened around September 11, 2011, Mr. Speaker. And the horrifying images that we all saw and what that brought, the kind of tears and emotion that brought to many persons. And we saw what subsequently happened after that, when the enactment of the Patriot Act in the United States. And to this day, well, the surveillance tools that are being used have protected and saved lives. You see on a regular basis sometimes how overreaching could sort of undermine the civil liberties of individuals and the human rights of individuals if you don't have the correct checks and balances, particularly in those pieces of legislation. Mr. Speaker, I think we're heading down the same road with this piece of legislation if we don't ensure. Yes, we want to protect our citizenry. We want to ensure that we have the crime-fighting tools in place for the police force. But we also have to ensure that the necessary checks and balances, as everyone has been saying tonight, are in place to do so. And the elements of this which I'll bring out in my contribution, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, Section 35, Section 35B and C, Section 5, where it speaks to the governor has the right to make, it reads, and if I may, Mr. Speaker, read from the bill. Section 5 says, 35.5 says, the governor may make regulations prescribing the procedures for, and it lists A, the taking and handling of storage of witness statements, the training of police officers in the procedures under paragraph A, and C, such are the matters as are necessary or expedient to give effect to this section, Mr. Speaker. See, again, nothing is wrong with the regulation section of this, Mr. Speaker, but it has to come to the House for affirmative resolution, as was mentioned earlier by the Deputy Premier. Mr. Speaker, I think that's a necessary checks and balance to ensure that once the regulations are made, the House has an opportunity to debate, the public has an opportunity to know what is in these regulations that will impact themselves and the citizenry before they're actually brought into force, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, another section of concern, Mr. Speaker, is Section 12, 35C, 12. Where it says, a person who commits an offense under subsection 11 is liable, A, on summary conviction to a fine, and they list out the fines of over $100,000 or 5 years imprisonment. B, on conviction or indictment, or a fine of $500,000 and or imprisonment of up to 10 years, Mr. Speaker. Speaker, again, we have to ensure that the crime and the penalty match up, Mr. Speaker. We heard members speak specifically about the threshold, which is a year in prison, which a summary offense could be up to a year in prison. We have to ensure that the penalties that are being meted out are matched up as relates to this particular penalty regime, Mr. Speaker. Again, Section 13, again, with the governor, commissioner, the DPP may make regulations respecting and it lists the sections, Mr. Speaker. Again, I believe that section needs to be brought to the House of Assembly for affirmative resolution for the House to make the. Mr. Speaker, Section 38 that speaks to special investigative techniques. And this is where we speak specifically to the controlled delivery, electronic surveillance, investigative authority, law enforcement officer, and what that means, and those persons who are the ones who will be authorized to carry out these covert or otherwise these other investigative techniques, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, again, we have to ensure, and I want to make something clear, Mr. Speaker, these are all tools that are being used not just in the region, internationally as well. These are tools that law enforcement agencies are being used. But again, we have to ensure, and we have the Data Protection Act of 2021, which was passed in this House of Assembly, Mr. Speaker. And we have to ensure that the protections that were derived within that particular act are preserved, and a person's data and private information is not captured in a way that infringes on their human rights, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, so this section, again, we have to ensure that the regime has the necessary safeguards to protect the citizens of this country, but also to ensure that the police and the police force has the necessary tools to perform their duties as law enforcement agencies, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, there are two areas that I'm going to touch on before I wrap up, Mr. Speaker, and I also share this concern concerning the indemnification of persons for committing, persons who are conducting this 38L, protection from liability, Mr. Speaker. 38L speaks to 38LI1 says, notwithstanding any other law, an authorized person who engages in conduct authorized under this part shall not be subject to criminal or civil liability for that conduct, even if such participation would, but for this part, constitute an offense. And B goes on to speak to subsection 1 shall apply retrospectively to any participant in a covert operation or controlled delivery conducted prior to the commencement of this part, provided that a requirement of, and it has a list of 38C, 38H, and 38I, which is the ones that are going to be indemnified, Mr. Speaker. Madam Speaker, you're back. So, Madam Speaker, 38M also goes on to further indemnify persons for acts that occur prior or before the commencement of this act. Madam Speaker, I agree with the members that spoke before on this particular section that we cannot indemnify actions that occur prior to the commencement of the act, and the House cannot be seen to be supporting and indemnifying that type of behavior, Mr. Speaker. Madam Speaker. Madam Speaker, Madam Speaker, there's some other sections that are of concern that were raised already by members, but I won't go into those details. Madam Speaker, while I have the specific concern about this bill, I support in principle what we are intended to do. The bill requires some significant work by members to ensure that the necessary checks and balances are in place, to also protect the citizenry, to ensure that there's no abuse of powers in terms of executing the powers, as we've seen with similar legislation vis-a-vis the Patriot Act in the United States, where you've seen civil liberties of individuals that have been eroded, Madam Speaker. So, Madam Speaker, I look forward to the discussion in the committee stage to ensure that we go through clause by clause, those specific clauses, to ensure that we have a bill that is fit for purpose to address the issue as it relates to crime in this territory. I hear the Premier, and I wanted to make it clear that I don't support criminality in this country. I think none of us in this House supports the issue of criminality in this country. Everyone in this House is concerned about what is happening in this territory as it relates to criminality. And it's not an issue of politicizing criminality in this House, Madam Speaker. But I think it's important for us, while we're trying to protect one thing, we don't use the law, weaponize the law in a way that we create a police state in the territory where persons feel that every step they go, that their privacy is being evaded or invaded by surveillance tools, surveillance mechanisms, and the likes, and we ignore the very laws that we have on the books that relates to our data protection legislation that has been put in place to protect the data and the integrity of the data for persons in this territory, Madam Speaker. So, Madam Speaker, again, I look forward to the discussion in committee as we go through the bill clause by clause and get a bill that is fit for purpose for this territory and the people of the Virgin Islands. Thank you.